Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Cities by Steven. You're talking to Steven and Ryan, my friend, my good buddy Ryan, who is a real transit planner. We are. This is the second video of a transit by Ryan playlist, I guess, inside of the City of New Lancaster's playlist, and we are going to be talking about bus lines and bus routes and bus stops with a real transit planner. So if you have any questions down below that we didn't answer in today's video, or if you have any questions for a real transit planner about how buses are used in cities, please leave comments down in the comment section below, and we'll talk about it in the next installment of Transit by Ryan. So we're going to do a little introduction again for those who haven't seen the previous video, but that video will be linked up right here in the top part of your screen. So Ryan, why don't you introduce yourself?
Well, thanks for having me back, Steve. This is really exciting. I had such a fun time, and I felt a really warm reception from the Cities by Steven community. So I'm just delighted to be able to offer a little bit of my knowledge again. So for those that may have not heard last time, I worked in the GIS, which is Geographic Information Systems field. And through that, I found work in transit planning in a Canadian metropolitan area. And so that gave me the opportunity to work on the ground and at the planning table, making maps and helping decision-making processes so that we could effectuate real-world decisions for transit planning. And in so doing, I picked up a few tricks along the way that gives me a bit of knowledge to talk from. And so what I thought I'd do maybe, Steve, is I have two transit planning jokes, or rather urban planning jokes for your listeners. So if you don't mind, if you want to indulge me here, I'll read them off. So let's start here. There's a judge, a bishop, and a planner having a conversation. All three are rather vain, and they talk soon about who is the greatest. So, said the judge, my position is one of dignity and power. When I walk into the courtroom, the bailiff says, all rise, and all the people stand to pay me honor. That's very nice, said the bishop. Please, people will stand in your honor, but when people have an audience with me, they kneel, kiss my ring, and dress me as your eminence. Well, the planner snorts and says, I think I've got you both beat. When I walk into any room as the consultant, the people look down, put their hands over their eyes and say, oh my God. And I can do one better than that. Okay. Joke number two. When considering the behavior of a howitzer, a mathematician will be able to calculate where the shell will land. A physicist will be able to explain how the shell gets there. But the planner will stand there to make sure it doesn't land without permission. So with that in mind, let's get to the dirty work here. Of course, those jokes speak a little bit to what it's like to be a planner. We are the people that make things go in order. And for that reason, it helps bring a bit of flow to the city.
Well, that was a great introduction, Ryan. Love the jokes. Bring some more for next time as well. So just a little bit of a caveat before we get going into some of the main topics of the video. The video you're seeing in the background is me completely redoing the bus routes in the city. The previous video with Ryan, we made bus routes in the city before the city was probably about half the size it is now. So the city needed a transit overhaul completely. And if you've seen the videos before, we've added tram lines and a subway, but it needed a massive transit overhaul. So what you're seeing in the background is the bus routes being replanned based off of what we're talking about today. So another thing I want to mention is that the city is nowhere near complete. And there will be another revision of the bus lines when the city grows, because we're going to add areas that don't exist right now. And we're going to grow, some areas that exist currently are going to go from low density to high density, which is going to change how the transit lines or the transit system works. So, Ryan, how are buses supposed to be used? We're going to kind of do a summary of kind of what we talked about last time.
Well, I'll answer that in a pretty straightforward sense. Buses are meant to be used by pedestrians, accessed from the street level, generally speaking, and to create a funnel, if you will, so that people enter a transit network from an entry point, which is technically the door of the bus, or you might consider that the bus stop. And when you get on that bus at that stop, now you're on the transit network. And what can happen is it allows the city to funnel people onto certain parts of its road network. And in so doing, you create a certain momentary density that creates, in effect, space elsewhere. It frees up road space elsewhere. And then using those funneled systems, those hyper-dense forms of transit, 50 people on a bus versus 1 or 2 people in a car, you can then deliver people to other nodes along that funneled network and leave at a certain point that is convenient and closest to your destination. So buses are a way of shortening the distance from origin to destination without creating a need or space for the user on the road network in a large sense. So if I'm a car, I take up a whole lane of traffic for about 4 meters of distance. If I'm a bus user, well, I'm now just about 2 square feet on a bus that is 50 feet long in 1 lane of traffic, and there can be 50 of us on this bus. So yeah, how are buses used? Buses are used to promote density, momentary density in transit, so that space is freed up for perhaps more buses, or for, in what we're seeing nowadays, pedestrianization of former transit spaces. See this in, for example, New York City. Times Square famously has done this to its entire street network there, freed it up for pedestrians. So thanks to buses, we can do stuff like this.
Thank you, buses. And I guess this kind of goes without saying, but buses are definitely used differently during a pandemic than outside of a pandemic. Yeah, COVID sucks. So thank you, Ryan. We're gonna go on to the next thing I want to kind of talk about. If you want to learn more about kind of what we were just discussing, you can go watch the hour-long special we had with Ryan in his first video on the channel. So Ryan, I'm having difficulty in this city with figuring out how to get buses to run through the downtown of a city when there is so much traffic to begin with, and I need to figure out which routes the buses need to take in the downtown. How does a city planner go about choosing how buses run in a downtown?
Well, Steve, it's a great question because it ultimately speaks to the sheer complexity of what is the arterial functionality of a city. I think what I was speaking to last time is how I'm really impressed by what this game offers the user in terms of tools and real world conditions that are reflected that you can play with. And you're identifying quite clearly how fast that becomes kind of overwhelming, having to manage the size and scale of an entire network of people interacting with places, and then the flow and movement amongst them. So first and foremost, what I would say is there's not one clean answer, but what we can do is we can look at real conditions to start working from something. If you don't have something to anchor yourself to, well, you'll make no work. But if you at least take some data, or you take some real conditions, then we can start from that corner. So when I look at this wonderful city and the way that it's laid out, we know that we've got New Lancaster, which is the beating heart that has then allowed some growth off into the eastern shores of the river. So now we see Mapleton and the financial and IT districts popping up. We've got somewhat sort of a densifying river section there, becoming a larger core. And then we've got a lovely suburban area sort of heading out to the west and to the north end with some business parks scattered throughout. So what are our buses going to do for us right now? Well, you're at a point here where we've actually have the implementation of mixed modal transportation. Mixed modal transportation is just another way of saying having more than just the option of buses available. Now, any city, or most cities, typically have the baseline availability to drive, to have a car. This isn't always the case, and actually it's quite interesting if you look at examples such as Copenhagen, where I believe there, or Stockholm, have in fact ruled out cars from the city center. So anyhow, with them excluded from this example, cars are always an option. Now, what we had as far as the last video was the introduction of buses. And buses gave your citizens an ability to, as I kind of explained, hop on the transit network, funnel themselves onto it, and arrive at a node at some point that was convenient to them, and to exit it as a pedestrian. Now what we see is you've got subway and tram introduction, as well as possibly the potential for even some maritime travel. So at this point, because buses are one tier of a nested set of transit options in multimodal transportation, buses are going to work in conjunction with our subway and with our tram to disperse people. Picture this like now, whereas before the subway, or rather the bus lines, were the main arteries. Now our subway is our main artery, and our buses are going to serve like the small arterial veins that come off to extend to the ends of our fingertips, if you will. And I always like to think of the city as a in a very human or biological metaphor, because it does have a lot of the similar patterns that resolve. So pardon to your listeners, I'm no biologist, but I make many analogies to that effect. So we're going to be using buses essentially to strengthen those connections out into the spaces where we're not going to drag a subway line or a tram line, because they are heavier gauge and they are larger operations that don't just weave in and out of the small tight nooks and crannies of the city. But that's where buses now come in. So how do we go about setting that up? Well, we axe ourselves on what we have. What we have so far is a really strong beginning of a subway line. This looks to me right now, if I was to give a real world equivalent, to like Manhattan and Brooklyn, because we see how the subway begins in New Lancaster by the piers. It hooks up towards the bridge and then comes down into a strong earning part of your city, which would be the equivalent of a Brooklyn. And we have this financial district here that there is going to be some high density residency and strong financial flows between these two sections. So we've got this one main artery now that I'm assuming will intend to extend as time goes on. But our buses for these two parts of town will be intended to bring people to that connection, because that's going to be, as a dedicated rail line, the fastest way to travel that distance. If you were to put a bus on the road and put the subway on the ground and travel that same route, we know that the subway is going to be the faster option. That's just how it works when you have a dedicated service like a rail line, especially one that is below ground. So what we want to do is bring people to that option through buses. So what we can't necessarily do is have every part of our entire city bringing people to just that main artery, because we don't want to run lines all the way from our exterior suburbs straight up into that subway line. What we want to do is we kind of want to pass people off. We want to bring them into the periphery of it, and then we want them to transfer onto a more urban line, something that's going to run a faster shuttle, and then that will likely connect onto our nodes of the subway line so that people can get onto the main section. And I spoke about this last time, but essentially transit and cities in general are always about scales of density. We want to, at the top end, we have high-rise towers and subway or high-density rail line for passenger movement, and that trickles down to then mid-density development of houses and commercial space and street-level options such as tram or buses, all the way down to the commuter, pedestrian, suburban houses and low-density travel options. So our buses are going to be that middle range part where we're going to bring people from the low-end density and bring them into the high-density space, where then suddenly we actually get rid of a lot of those mid-density travel options like buses to service people mainly with mid to high-density options such as trams or subway. So I think that kind of explains the direction we're going to head with this, and we'll see how that shakes out.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. So when you're planning a bus route in a downtown, you need to choose an artery of the city, like an arterial road, and kind of dedicate it as a bus line.
Absolutely. And to pick up on that, absolutely, Steve. These things tend to evolve up on themselves, right? What we don't do in a city is to start completely anew in new space when we add in a new option. So, first what we might do, if we picture we're just an open field and nothing there, we'll stomp a dirt path, right? We'll walk over it back and forth, stomp our dirt path. And then along that dirt path, we might plant some trees and plant some crops and build a little house along that dirt path. And as the time goes on, we might, pave that path, and now it becomes stone. And we're going to continue to travel that path. Well, at that point, then as our house grows a little bit more, we have some people that come out of our house and they build their house along that little dirt, that now paved path. What we might do is, again, add some sidewalks to that little path and upgrade it, add some flowers along it. So essentially what we're doing is constantly renewalating, and sorry, my French sometimes comes in there, over top of a singular section, because that's where development will occur. Wherever we've initially chosen to develop, that's where we're going to see increased density already appearing, because it will have been encouraged because of prior transit planning decisions. So as we go up to subway lines and as we go up to tram lines, we're effectively going to lay them over top of existing network spaces, for the most part. There are obvious exceptions to this rule. Sometimes cities make complete overhauls, like what was occurring in San Francisco, that used to have a highway that ran right along the shoreline and was then later taken out to create more residential and industrial space. But for the most part, what we're going to see is that the places that began as the main arterial sections will stay and only continue to develop in such a way. And so that's what's going to lead us to putting subways over where we once had our major bus lines running. So in the last video, we ended up deciding that to be predominantly through New Lancaster, alongside Alexander Keith's Memorial Park, and right down the middle of the area of New Lancaster, running north-south, that was going to pick up the most amount of people and deliver them north and south and help spread them east and west as need be. But now what we're seeing is the city's actually shifting a little bit towards the east in terms of its sort of geographic center. And New Lancaster Piers is becoming one of the main hubs, as well as the North End Financial District becoming another one of the hubs. So we're going to see a shift towards that way. But essentially, our buses are going to evolve into the next phases of higher gauge transit.
That was a great answer, Ryan. Thank you. So now that we've talked about how downtowns kind of work, can you hear me, Ryan?
Yep.
Okay, sorry, I had a bit of an internet glitch on my end. So now that we've kind of talked about how downtown buses work, you've mentioned that you need to kind of get people from residential areas to hubs of transit to main lines in order for people to use transit effectively. So how do people who live in suburbs, how do they use buses? And how are buses supposed to be planned in suburbs?
Well, sorry for cutting me off, Steve. I'm just so excited to get to talking about suburb travel, because I think it's a really interesting phenomenon, because it fundamentally operates differently than how we see interurban transit working. So we'll give two different scenarios here. On our first scenario, we've got a suburban dweller, a home in the suburbs, about 3 to 5 kilometers out from the main city center. And on the other hand, we've got an apartment building, a dwelling in an apartment building in the city center, no more than at most 700 meters from what is considered that middle urban area. Now, what we know in these two scenarios is that suburban house is probably having to travel distances of about 1 kilometer to access groceries and main services that are clustered in suburbs, that tend to be clustered, larger scale facilities that serve a broader geographic area, but probably still have similar numbers in terms of users to what our interurban dweller will experience, but will travel considerably smaller distances to access those goods and services. And because of the fact that there are more people within the geographic surrounding of those spots, those businesses tend to stay open longer. So what we've got here is two people that actually just live by virtue of their their density conditions, different styles of life. So in the morning, what we're going to see is our suburban dweller has to travel a considerable distance to enter into the main city network, probably more often than not to go to work. Whereas our intercity dweller is more often than not already within the region of their work by no more than, in real world conditions, probably a 20 to 30 minute commute. So we're looking at a considerable difference in terms of commute and the sort of circulation that comes from them. So what suburban bus lines do is they operate fundamentally differently by serving specific times of the day. For suburban dwellers, the main goal is to leave that suburb and to enter into the city area. And they're really only going to do this on a Monday to Friday basis on 2 different times. That's the morning and then that's the afternoon, heading home from work. So it would be a little bit of a waste if we have lines that effectively ran from the suburb to the city and back all day long at the same rhythm, because they're either going to have inadequately underserved the morning commuters and afternoon commuters, whilst then providing over service throughout the rest of the day, or the opposite, they'll provide optimal service for the morning and afternoon, but they'll be far over serving the parts of the day where relatively few people are leaving the suburbs and coming to the city, and then vice versa. Whereas, again, we talk about our intercity user, that person and their surroundings are often catching the bus to go 2 blocks up to catch a meeting at a different building, or they're going to, head a couple blocks over to go for groceries, circulate back on their lunch break, and then head back to work. So the bus lines that we see in the city tend to have a constant rhythm throughout the day that they follow, whereas our suburban bus lines, they ramp up and they ramp down at 2 different times of the day, peak times, to serve the people commuting. And that's the effective difference. We're talking about commuting lines versus traveling lines, lines that just allow you to make better distance than you could on foot. There's no way you're going to walk as a suburban dweller to where you work. So you're obviously going to have to park yourself in a seat and do something to get from A to B. Whereas our inner city option has the ability to walk more often than not. But the idea is to provide a bus that is just getting them off the sidewalk and creating a bit faster travel throughout the city and make it more equitable for those with mobility needs. So our suburban line, what we're planning for here is to pick up people from a space where in real world conditions, roads are wider, speeds are higher, and that are the point at which the main arterial branches off into local roads. Local roads being our cul-de-sacs and the branching network, so that what we'd see is perhaps I leave my house as a suburban dweller at 6:30 in the morning and I take a 15-minute jaunt out of my cul-de-sac, walk through a few more local roads that are sort of feeding me towards the main arterial network. And about 15 minutes later, I arrive at a bus stop in my suburban neighborhood where myself and the 50 other people that left our houses and our cul-de-sacs now gather at to catch a commuting line bus that's going to come quite rapidly in the morning. And then that will drop us off to a transit hub somewhere closer to the network, so that from there we can transfer onto a bus line that heads the way that we need to go. Because my work is not going to be where necessarily all the other workers are who are living in the suburbs. But what we can do is we can transfer at that hub to now a dedicated line, so that not all those dedicated lines are branching into our suburbs to pick us up right from door to door, but instead we go from one common space to another common space, and from those common spaces to more specific destinations. And in a real world condition, that's just the delicate planning that goes into finding out the numbers of people who are working and where the general residential populations are in suburbs. So we'll take, for instance, Victoria Heights and Beach District and the currently unnamed northern suburb cul-de-sacs that we see. And what we might want to do is have perhaps 1 or 2 main suburban hubs that are going to collect our dwellers, that they're going to either walk or maybe even have a park and ride. They leave their house by car and drive for 5 minutes to a place where they can park their car, a communal area. And from there, those buses will probably take us to our main hubs, We've got one main transit hub in Victoria Heights on the south end, as well as some developing hubs in sort of the industrial square area. And what we want to do is drop people off there, and from there we can then transfer them onto the main network, and they can be circulated a lot faster, either on rail or by rapid shuttle buses within the intercity space. So yeah, our goal with the suburban network is really just to not go door to door, but instead try to get within the vicinity of a good amount of people, and then get them funneled back into our network as fast as possible. And I think this is going to lead into the following question that you've got here, Steve. So I'll let you ask it, and then I'll sort of touch back on some differences of suburban and intercity bus planning.
So it's kind of like a tree in that the trunk of the tree is like the main arteries of the transit network, like the subways, the trams. And then the first branch off of the trunk is like a bus that goes from the transit lines to the suburbs. And then the little teeny trees with all the little teeny branches with all the leaves are the suburban networks. So that's kind of like that, how it funnels down into the trunk.
That's a perfect analogy. Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to kind of combine the next two questions, if you don't mind. So I kind of have the next two questions I had kind of planned were how, or kind of summarized into being, how do you choose where a bus stop is? And how do you choose where to plan bus stops along major transit networks? So like if I have a bus going to a subway station, does the bus stop go right outside of the front of the subway station, or does it go a block away? So if that makes any sense, you can take that kind of question however you want, Ryan.
So let's talk about choosing our bus stops. Now, I think it'd be really interesting for your users to just take notice in their own cities and residences of dwelling where they see bus stops located. Now, something I thought I would comment on for our new Lancaster city here, and looking at the bus stops that we've got, generally seeing that we've got them placed midway through the block. Now, as far as a transit planning principle is concerned, what we actually want to do is we want to put that bus stop at the corner of an intersection. And the reason we do that is pretty straightforward, although this game has a bit of a quirk to it that we don't tend to have traffic lights here or even stop signs. We're doing some level of autonomous driving of open roads here. I love it. But generally speaking, why we put a bus stop on the corner is because the bus is otherwise coming to a stop anyways. And if we can think logically about that, if the bus has to stop to begin, then it's probably a good time to let people on and off rather than stopping 20 feet out from an intersection, let people on and off, and then continuing to pull up ahead to get to a stop sign. So that's first and foremost, as far as laying bus stops along a street goes, right on the corner where the bus can pull over into a wider intersection space and take up that turning lane or take up a dedicated lane for letting people off the bus, which is essentially the egress is what we call. I'm looking for the term here, the egress periods when you're getting off of a bus or off of a transit network. So corners, first and foremost, are our choices here. Now let's speak about spacing. Let's compare, and as I was kind of alluding to, a bit of a comparison between suburban and urban bus stop spacing. When we're in the suburban network, optimal speaking, about every 400 meters, maybe as much as 600 meters between stops. If you think about yourself as being equidistant between two stops, having to walk 400 meters is a fair bit of distance for a stop. That would take the average person probably about 10 minutes to walk, maybe about 10 minutes to walk 400 meters. So we want to shorten that. We want them ideally to only ever have to walk as much as about 300 meters from their origin to get onto a bus stop. Although in real world conditions, this ends up being a lot larger. Ideally speaking, in a suburb, we want them to be spaced out relatively far so the bus can travel relatively quickly through the suburb, collect the people at dedicated times, and they're going to know when the bus is coming through, so they'll be able to be there right on the mark, and then help it to move along without having to stop too much. In a urban environment, the buses tend to be stopping more frequently anyways, just because of the fact of traffic being around. So if the bus is meant to stop and there are a number of destinations to go to and a number of people who are going to be getting on and off in somewhat of a shuttle fashion, you're going to have closer stops. In real world conditions, this can be as much as every 200 meters having a bus stop, so that someone who's equidistant is only ever walking about 100 meters. You might actually see this in your own cities where you can stand on certain spots on a street and see 2 stops, if not 3, along a line. And that's actually with good reason, just because the bus is going to have to stop and go traffic anyways. We might as well give people a way to get onto the network without having to go too far. But 200 meters is probably also our minimum. Anything closer than that, and we are again stopping too often. We just are not giving the bus enough time to make a distance where it has to then pull itself out of traffic, get up to the side of the road, make a full stop, open doors, allow the egress, allow people to ingress, which means to get on the bus, and then move on again. So 200 meters is our touchy, sort of like perfect optimal distance in the city. And if we can have a little bit of extra space in between, it usually means taking 3 stops and combining them into 2 by looking at how we can reorganize them to put people on a more optimal street corner when they get out. But relatively speaking, 200 meters is a pretty safe distance. And in real world conditions, city streets tend to be, or city blocks rather, tend to be about 100 to 200 meters long. So it works kind of like a yardstick. You have a city block, you have a stop. City block, you have a stop. Inner city, maybe they tend to be a little shorter. So 2 blocks, then you have a stop. 2 blocks, then you have a stop. Whereas our suburban network, well, because we might go a lot farther, maybe about 600 meters, we have a stop, and then that stop allows you to enter into the more branched off cul-de-sac area. And we won't even bother weaving in and through the cul-de-sac. Instead, we'll rather just make a pass by it and allow people to come out to the network from their residential areas. So that kind of answers the spacing question. And of course, choosing where to put our stops, well, that has somewhat of an answer found in, again, real world conditions or in-game conditions. What are our destinations? If the choice is a 20 meters north or south distance, but 20 meters north lets you off by the public library and 20 meters south lets you off by a private gym, probably makes most sense to put it by the library, where the maximum amount of users of the transit network also have free access to the library, and that library can act as somewhat of a dispersion area. Whereas the gym, although there's going to be several people taking the bus to the gym, it just has a smaller municipal value to the average person. Although important, it won't be as important as the library. So it ends up just meaning weighing 2 options together. But of course, and a really interesting scenario to think about too, is bus maneuvering. So I don't have street names here, so I can't necessarily peg this for people. But let's imagine a scenario where our bus has to take a left turn. Now, we know we let people off on the right-hand side of the road, and I'm speaking from a very North American-centric position here in my country. We drive on the right-hand side of the road here, so we let people off on the right-hand side of the road because that's where our passenger side door is. Okay, so with that out of the way, that disclaimer, and the Canadian context established, let's imagine a bus letting people out on the right-hand side of the road that in 2 blocks time needs to make a left turn. So although it might be optimal spacing-wise and logistically because of a destination point that is further towards that intersection where the left turn is to be made, to put a bus stop there, it's almost impossible to guarantee the bus enough time to cross 2, perhaps 3 lanes of traffic to get into that left turn lane. And so for that matter, we just are restricted as to where we can put that bus stop. We have to set it back a bit to allow time for the light to turn green, the bus to signal it's taking a left lane change, pull through the intersection, and then switch over a couple of lanes to make that left turn so that users who wanted to get off closer to that intersection might have to get off before or after and do a little bit of walking. And that's just sort of some of the real world conditions that come up. We can't really prevent that other than reconfiguring the entire bus network altogether. But more often than not, these things are just predetermined. Sometimes buses have to take left turns, and sometimes they get kind of caught in a sticky spot. And so we have to put a bus stop somewhere where is less than optimal, but although less than optimal, still properly serves and allows the transit operator the safety and ability to cross that. Now, there's another interesting thing here, and it's there's two ways to serve this. What I love about working in transit planning is we are the top dogs. We get to be the decision makers. The be all and end all ends with us. So if we need something, we ask the city to jump. The city's intended to say how high. So with that in mind, and if your listeners can take a look again around their cities, some of the more strong functioning municipal environments will demonstrate such things. Sometimes we have a left turn lane that is actually built dedicated for buses in the right lane, because we have a scenario where we just, for all means, need to put that bus stop on a corner before taking a left turn at an intersection. And so what we do is we give it a dedicated light cycle. This light goes green, and at this current moment, only the bus in that right lane can cross all the lanes of traffic to take a left turn, whereas it would otherwise have to be 2 lanes over in the left turning lane to go left. I know I've been throwing around a lot of lefts and rights here, so I hope I haven't caused some vertigo for your listeners. I hope we've all kept ourselves squared here. So that's one option. Another option that's really effective is light delays. And in this case, and what users might not realize, or what your listeners might not realize, is how much the city is wired to communicate with buses. Buses are constantly driving over what we call a bus loop. It's essentially a piece of metal wire under the ground that signals that the bus has passed by. And what that will do is it will often add a little bit more time on a light to allow a bus to pass through. So when the light's about to turn red, our bus passes over the loop. It triggers the light to stay open for about 30 seconds longer, just to give our bus enough time to pass through, and then the light to shut behind it, so that the bus finds itself in a low traffic environment having passed the light. And what another great idea is if you connect bus loops and light delays with putting a bus stop on the far side of an intersection. Now what you can do is actually clear the intersection and be in a completely wide open space to allow egress and ingress, and then have all the lanes of traffic free to make your left turn, to move over lanes, to manipulate the bus. So these are just some of the finer details of operating a bus that kind of force our hand, if you will, where we're going to put a bus stop. Because unlike a subway that follows a fixed path, a bus is still wide open in how it operates on the road. But given its size and scale compared to the cars, and the fact that cars are going to act in an autonomous fashion that we have to integrate with, we have to encourage a bit of flexibility for our bus to allow our operators to drive safely and effectively and meet our stops. So that's just a little bit of an idea of how we might space and how we might place a bus stop.
That was a really good explanation, Ryan, especially on when you were talking about when you have a bus turning left, where do you put the stop if you need a stop before it turns left? Because that can sure cause a lot of traffic. If a bus has to cross a few lanes just to make one turn, and there's a lot of traffic on the road, and the bus is stopped on the right side of the road, that sounds messy.
And I should point out, Steve, that the same goes for once you've made that left turn. You still have to get over to the right lane to find the next bus stop. So what does this mean? It means if there's one thing transit planners avoid the most, it's left turns. Because any left turn means we have to give the bus adequate time to get over and adequate time to get back. And that's why dedicated bus lanes are great, because it allows the bus to move through the traffic at its own pace and then exit the bus lane to get into a left turning lane and come back at a safe time. But more often than not, if users pay attention, buses are going to function in a sort of a clockwise or counterclockwise way, so that they are making right turns the most as possible and avoiding left turn scenarios. And they're sometimes unavoidable, but they're highly ineffective for circulation. That's
a great answer. I I have one more question that's kind of off the books, Ryan. We didn't plan this one, and I was wondering if you have any insight on how bus lines end and how do they loop back? Because in this game, trying to loop back a bus line, or how about maybe even having a second bus line that runs the counterclockwise to it, to the first bus line. So you have one bus line that's going clockwise in a loop and another one going counterclockwise in a loop. Whereas perhaps maybe you could get the same bus line looping around, so you don't need to have two bus lines doing this, like running on opposite sides of the road. How do you plan dead end bus lines, or how do you get bus lines to loop back? Is there any city planning insight you have for that?
Well, actually, Steve, you touched on a really straightforward principle of operating bus lines. And I'm not sure if the game gives you this option, but what your users, I'm happy to sort of explain about, and they can even actually see if they can pay attention to see if they can notice this in their cities, is what's called deadheading. And no, deadheading is not some sort of musical term or some sort of genre of 90s music. No, deadheading is a bus term. And what this effectively means, and you kind of alluded to this, is when you have a dead end, what do you do with the bus? So what that is, a deadhead, let's imagine a scenario where we've got the last stop on a line and we need the bus to now turn around and come back the other way. We know that no one's going to get on heading, if our bus is heading south towards this dead end, they're not going to get on an earlier stop to then ride it for the turnaround and come back. What they're going to do is they're going to cross the street and catch the northbound stop. When we just force this hand, because the way that the bus network is laid out, we enforce the fact that the bus is going to come to one end of the line, it has to be empty, and it will return back and come back along the north path. So what we have here is we get to our last stop heading south. We've now got an empty bus. What we do as a deadhead is we have an unofficial route that is not public, where the bus is going to continue forward, probably make a series of right turns. Perhaps it's going to be a left turn and then a right and a right, to orient itself back towards where it was coming from, or a right, and then a left, if you will, to do the same sort of thing. And now the bus is heading the opposite direction on that route, having done what is called a deadhead. And in real world conditions, that deadhead actually gives the operator time to take a break. Not always, and often enough, they'll be scheduled so that, one in every 6 passes through that deadhead loop, then you'll take your break. But it's effectively time where, if you notice for this, the bus light's going to go off, the number's going to come off the top of the bus is going to proceed out down the road, and within about 30 seconds to maybe 10 minutes later, depending on the type of route and the time of the day, the bus will reappear coming back up the same way that it came. But it's effectively just space where the bus isn't serving any customers, but it's allowing the bus to operate and to reconfigure itself to come back on the same path. So I'm not sure if the game gives you the functionality to create a deadhead route, but deadheads actually are very important in the city planning terms to allow us to orient buses and reorient buses. And we use, often enough, specific roads for deadheading that aren't used in the otherwise encompassed transit network. Because what we've done here is we've allowed ourselves perhaps larger turning spaces, or even in some cases, they might be tighter turning spaces because we don't have to worry about a busload of people and manipulating through traffic. They're quieter streets, tighter turns, but the bus can take its time to deadhead through it and then reorient itself and come back the same way. So effectively, we've got a one-line system. It goes from one end to the other, and the bus is going to travel along that path. And when it gets to the end, it'll do an unvisualized deadhead, make a little loop, and head on back the same way it came. And we've put several buses on that line, and they just do the same sort of thing. And this looks the same actually in terms of subways. And so, if we've got any listeners here who live in a city with a subway line, I encourage you to take your line all the way to the end one day, ride it right to the last stop. What you're going to notice is that there's probably about 1 kilometer of track that extends beyond that station, and it does the same thing as a deadhead. It's going to continue along straight, and so the train will travel along that path, switch onto a new gauge, and come back out the other side, and serve the customers who are now heading on the opposite way to the other end of the line. And so if you look for this, if you find yourself a last stop on a bus stop, or the last transit line stop on a subway or tram network, you're going to see these types of provisions put in place. They're loops, or they're extensive track, or they're extra road space where the bus can just turn around. And that's what we call the deadhead.
That's a great answer, Ryan. And I didn't really know how that worked personally, and I'm sure some of our listeners might not know how that works in our city. So thank you very much for the insight. And that's where we're going to kind of end today's Transit by Ryan video. Ryan, thank you very much for your insight and all your amazingness, I'm going to say.
Well, thank you very much to your listeners for putting up with me and for listening to my cheesy jokes. I'll hopefully have some better ones for you when I come next time, and we'll see how this shakes out. I'm just so in love with what's going on here in New Lancaster, and I think what we're seeing here is a really accurate development of how cities go. It's never perfect, but we're always just sort of building on what we've got and making sense as we go and trying to please the most amount of people as possible. At the end of the day, it's for the taxpayers' purpose that we build our transit networks, and we gotta please heads, and sometimes we have to make compromises and sacrifices. So this is the fun of doing what we do, and it's the reason why we need a lot of coffee to keep running. So keep at it.
Well, thank you, Ryan. I appreciate you coming on. We'll have Ryan on in a other video down the road once the city starts developing a bit more, and we need Ryan's insight on how the city needs to improve its transit at that point, because I know that the city will definitely need another transit overhaul beyond the transit overhaul we have going on in the background of the video today, because next episode is the hour-long special in which we are going to buy 2 new tiles, and the cities are going to grow very rapidly from this point on. So that means that the transit will need to grow rapidly as well. So thank you very much for watching. Have a good one. Make sure you hit the like button, hit subscribe, and get that bell notification on so you don't miss out on the next video of the city of New Lancaster. Peace out, everyone.